The rain hammered against the roof of our house in suburban Oregon, a relentless assault that matched the storm raging inside me. I sat in the living room, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The leather couch creaked beneath me as I shifted, a glass of bourbon clutched in my hand, its burn a fleeting distraction from the ache in my chest. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and her perfume, lingering, taunting, a reminder of what I'd lost. She wasn't here, not tonight, but her presence haunted every corner of this house. 2 nights ago, she'd stood in this very room, her green eyes cold and unyielding, and delivered the blow that still echoed in my skull. If you weren't so weak, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere. Weakness. The word was a blade, slicing through the fragile threads of my self-worth. I'd heard it before, in the way she'd sigh when I avoided confrontation, in the dismissive tilt of her head when I tried to please her. But to hear it spoken aloud, with such calculated cruelty, was a wound I couldn't staunch. I stared at the framed photo on the coffee table. Our wedding day, her smile radiant, my arm around her waist, both of us oblivious to the cracks that would form. That was 8 years ago, when love was a promise I believed in, when I thought I could be enough for her. Now, that photo felt like a lie, a relic of a life that no longer existed. I remembered the early days, the ones that still cut me deepest. We'd met at a friend's party in Portland, her laughter drawing me in like a moth to flame. She was magnetic, bold, unpredictable, her chestnut hair falling in waves as she moved through the crowd. I'd been captivated from the start, swept up in her orbit, willing to follow wherever she led. I'd loved the way she'd press herself against me on quiet nights, her breath warm against my skin, whispering dreams of a future I could see so clearly. I'd loved the way she'd dance in the backyard under the stars, pulling me into her rhythm, her joy infectious. Those moments were vivid, etched into my memory like a film I couldn't stop replaying, and they made the present all the more unbearable. But that was gone. The woman who'd once looked at me with something like adoration had changed, or maybe I'd just been blind to who she really was. For months, I'd noticed the signs, the late nights she claimed were work, the phone she guarded like a secret, the faint scent of another man's cologne on her clothes. I'd confronted her 2 nights ago, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury, and she'd turned it back on me. You're too passive, too afraid to fight for me. What did you expect? She didn't name him, didn't need to. I knew there was someone else, someone she'd turn to while I sat here, drowning in my own inadequacy. I stood, the room tilting slightly from the bourbon, and crossed to the window. The street outside was a blur of rain and shadow, the world reduced to a gray smear. My reflection stared back at me, hollow eyes, a jaw clenched tight, a man on the edge of breaking. Weakness. Was that what I was? I'd given her everything. My love, my trust, my patience. I'd stayed silent when I should have demanded answers, stayed calm when I should have raged. I'd let her play her games, let her push me to the sidelines, believing it was my role to keep the peace. But peace had cost me everything. The anger came then, a slow simmer that rose from my gut and spread through my veins. I turned from the window, my gaze falling on the coat she'd left draped over a chair. She'd walked out that night, claiming she needed time to think, but I knew better. She'd gone to him, whoever he was, leaving me to stew in the wreckage of our life. I'd stood in the doorway as she left, watching her hesitate, waiting for me to beg her to stay. But I hadn't. I'd let her go, my silence a defiance she hadn't expected. And in that moment, something shifted. The pain was still there, raw and jagged, but beneath it, a question took root. Was it my weakness that drove her away, or her own inability to face herself? I returned to the couch, pouring another glass of bourbon, the liquid trembling in my hand. She thought she'd broken me, that her words had left me powerless. But she was wrong. I wasn't weak. I'd been too strong, too willing to endure, too patient with her lies. And now, as the rain continued its relentless assault, I felt the first stirrings of something new, a resolve, a clarity. She'd started this game, but I wouldn't let her finish it. I'd play along, for now, watching, waiting, until the moment was right. She'd claimed my weakness had forced her to stray, but I'd show her the truth. Her betrayal was her own, and I'd walk away stronger than she could ever imagine. The silence in the house was suffocating, a void that pressed against my ears until I could hear the blood pounding in my skull. It was 2 days since she'd walked out, leaving her coat on the chair and her words in my head. If you weren't so weak, I wouldn't have to look elsewhere. The rain had stopped, but the air inside was still heavy, damp with the memory of it, and the faint trace of her perfume lingered like a ghost I couldn't exorcise. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where she used to sit, the bourbon bottle my only company. The glass in my hand was empty now, but I didn't refill it. I needed to think, to feel the raw edge of this pain, to understand what I'd missed. I remembered the mornings we'd spent here, the quiet ones that felt like a sanctuary. She'd sit across from me, her hair a tangled mess from sleep, sipping coffee as the sunlight streamed through the window. We'd talk about small things, plans for the day, a hike in the Cascades, the way the fog clung to the trees outside. I'd loved her then, with a depth that scared me, a love that made me believe we were unbreakable. I'd loved the way she'd reach across the table to touch my hand, her fingers warm against mine, her smile a promise I'd clung to. But those moments were gone, replaced by a distance I couldn't bridge, a coldness that had crept in like the damp seeping through the walls. Now, alone in this house that felt more like a tomb, I couldn't shake the need to know. Who was he? Where had she gone? The signs had been there for months, her late nights, her guarded phone, the way she'd flinch when I got too close. I'd ignored them, telling myself it was stress, work, anything but the truth. But her words had shattered that illusion, and now I needed answers. I stood, the chair scraping against the hardwood, and moved to the bedroom. Our bedroom, though it hadn't been ours for a long time. Her side of the bed was untouched, the sheets still tucked in, a stark contrast to the chaos she'd left in me. I opened her dresser, my hands trembling as I rifled through her things. Scarves, sweaters, the detritus of a life I thought I knew. My fingers brushed against something hard, a small, black notebook tucked beneath a stack of clothes. I pulled it out, my breath catching as I flipped it open. Her handwriting stared back at me, sharp and precise, a list of dates and times scrawled across the pages. March 3rd, 8 p.m., Motel 6. March 10th, 9 p.m., same. My stomach twisted as I read on. The locations all within a 20-mile radius of our home. There were no names, no explicit confessions, but the implication was clear. She'd been meeting someone, planning it, while I sat here, blind and trusting. The anger surged again, hotter this time, a fire that burned away the fog of self-doubt. I slammed the notebook shut, my hands shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. Weakness, she'd said. But this wasn't weakness. This was betrayal, calculated and cold, a game she'd been playing while I played the fool. I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the house, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The streets were quiet, the suburban neighborhood asleep, but I was wide awake, my mind racing as I climbed into my car and started the engine. I drove to the edge of town, to the Motel 6 I'd seen on her list. It was a rundown place, the kind of spot where secrets festered behind closed doors. The neon sign flickered in the darkness, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. I pulled in, parking at a distance, and watched. The lot was half empty, a few cars scattered beneath the dim streetlights. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I couldn't stop myself. My eyes scanned the windows, the doors, searching for a glimpse of her, of him, of the life she'd chosen over me. And then I saw it, a figure stepping out of room 12, a man with broad shoulders and dark hair, lighting a cigarette as he leaned against the railing. He was alone, but something about the way he moved, the casual arrogance in his stance, told me he was the one. I didn't see her, but I didn't need to. The pieces were falling into place, and with them, a realization. She'd accused me of weakness to justify her own choices, to shift the blame onto me. But this wasn't about me. It was about her, her need, her dissatisfaction, her inability to face the emptiness inside her. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the anger giving way to something colder, more focused. I wouldn't confront him, not yet. I wouldn't run to her, begging for explanations. I'd watch, I'd wait, and I'd learn. She thought she'd broken me, but she'd only ignited something I'd buried too long. I wasn't weak. I'd been patient, enduring, and now I was awake. I drove home, the notebook burning a hole in my pocket, And as I stepped back into the silent house, I knew this was just the beginning. She'd started this game, but I'd finish it. The notebook sat on the kitchen table like a loaded gun, its pages a map to her betrayal. I'd brought it back from the car, unable to leave it behind, its weight a constant reminder of what I'd found. The bourbon bottle was still there, half empty, but I didn't touch it. I needed clarity now, not the haze of alcohol. The house was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the walls settling in the night. Outside, the world slept, but inside, I was unraveling a truth I'd been too blind, or too afraid, to see. I opened the notebook again, my fingers tracing the dates and times she'd scrawled in her precise handwriting. March 17th, 7 p.m., Daniel's place. March 20th, 10 p.m., Motel 6. Daniel. The name hit me like a punch to the gut, a single word that crystallized months of suspicion into something real. I knew him, Daniel Carter, a co-worker of hers from the tech firm downtown. I'd met him once at a company barbecue, a tall, smug man with a handshake too firm and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She'd laughed at his jokes that day, her hand brushing his arm, and I'd told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining the spark between them. But now, seeing his name in her handwriting, I knew I'd been a fool. I stood, the chair scraping against the floor, and moved to the home office we'd shared. Her laptop was still there, perched on the desk, a sleek silver machine that held more secrets than I could have imagined. I'd never snooped before. Trust had been my mantra, my shield. But that trust was dead now. I powered it on, the screen flickering to life, and entered her password. She'd never bothered to hide it from me, a small arrogance that now worked in my favor. The desktop loaded, cluttered with files and folders, but I wasn't interested in her work. I opened her email, my heart pounding as I scrolled through the inbox. There it was, buried among mundane messages. A thread with Daniel, the subject line blank. I clicked it open, my breath catching as I read. Can't wait to see you tonight, he'd written last week. You're right. He doesn't suspect a thing. Her reply was brief, cold. He's too passive to care. See you at 8. The words burned into me, each one a confirmation of her disdain, her deceit. But it was the earlier messages that cut deeper. I don't know if I can keep doing this, she'd written a month ago. What if he finds out? His response was dismissive. He won't. You said it yourself, he's weak. He'll never fight back. And then, her reply. You're right. I just hate feeling trapped. Trapped. The word lingered, a revelation that shifted the ground beneath me. She'd felt trapped, not by me, but by her own choices, her own lies. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling not with rage, but with a strange, cold clarity. She'd blamed me, called me weak, but these messages told a different story. She wasn't the confident, untouchable woman she pretended to be. She was scared, uncertain, caught in a web of her own making. And Daniel, he wasn't her savior, but her accomplice, feeding her insecurities while exploiting her doubt. I left the house again, the night air sharp against my skin as I climbed into my car. I drove to the Motel 6, the same rundown place I'd watched last night, parking in the shadows across the street. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the parking lot. I didn't expect to see her, not tonight, but I needed to be here, to see the place where her lies had taken root. And then, as if summoned by my thoughts, a car pulled in, a familiar black sedan, her car. She stepped out, her hair pulled back, her movements hurried as she crossed to room 12. Moments later, Daniel emerged, his posture tense, his voice carrying faintly as they argued. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. The way she gestured, the way he towered over her, told me everything. This wasn't love, it was chaos, a desperate dance of power and fear. I remembered a night years ago, when we'd fought over something trivial, a canceled trip, a forgotten promise. She'd cried then, clinging to me, begging me not to leave. I need you, she'd whispered, her voice raw with vulnerability. I'd stayed, comforted her, believing it was my role to hold us together. But now, watching her with Daniel, I saw the truth. That vulnerability wasn't love, it was manipulation, a tool she'd used to keep me close while she strayed. She wasn't trapped by me. She was trapped by herself, by her need for control, her fear of being alone. I drove home, the anger giving way to something sharper, more deliberate. She'd called me weak, but she was the one breaking under the weight of her choices. I wasn't the passive fool she thought I was. I'd been patient, watching, waiting. And now, I knew her secrets. I wouldn't confront her, not yet. I'd let her play her game, let her think she'd won. But I was done being her pawn. As I stepped back into the house, the notebook still open on the table, I felt a shift inside me. This wasn't about weakness anymore. It was about power, and I was ready to take it back. The morning light crept through the blinds, weak and gray, casting thin stripes across the kitchen floor. I hadn't slept, not really, just drifted in and out of a restless haze. The notebook still open on the table, its pages a testament to her lies. The house felt different now, less like a home and more like a battlefield, every corner marked by the war we'd waged in silence. Her coat still hung over the chair, her perfume still lingered in the air, but they didn't haunt me anymore. They were relics, remnants of a life I was ready to leave behind. I stood, my body stiff from the night, and poured the last of the bourbon down the sink. The amber liquid swirled in the drain, a symbolic purge of the weakness she'd accused me of. I remembered the days when this house was a refuge, when love was a tangible thing I could hold on to. We'd spent our first summer here painting the walls, her laughter echoing as she smeared paint on my cheek, her eyes bright with mischief. I'd loved her then, with a devotion that felt unbreakable, a belief that we could weather anything. I'd loved the way she'd curl into me on the couch, her head resting on my chest as we watched the rain fall outside. Those memories had once been my anchor, but now they were chains, binding me to a past that no longer existed. She'd taken that love and twisted it, used it to justify her betrayal, and I'd let her. But not anymore. I moved through the house with purpose, gathering her things, clothes, books, the trinkets she'd left scattered like breadcrumbs. I packed them into boxes, my hands steady, my mind clear. Each item was a piece of her I was letting go, a weight I was shedding. The wedding photo on the coffee table was the last to go. I stared at it for a moment, at the man I'd been, smiling, trusting, blind. I didn't recognize him anymore. I placed it in the box, sealing it shut with tape, and carried the boxes to the garage. They'd stay there until she came for them, if she ever did. I didn't care. They were out of my sight, out of my life. I left the house, the air outside crisp and damp, the sky a heavy blanket of clouds. I drove to a park on the edge of town, a place we'd once visited together, though the memory felt distant now. The trails were quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath my boots and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I walked, letting the solitude wash over me, my thoughts untangling as I moved. I passed families, couples, people living lives unburdened by the chaos I'd known. I envied them, but only for a moment. Their peace wasn't mine, not yet, but I was claiming something else: control, strength, the right to define myself beyond her accusations. I remembered our honeymoon, a week on the Oregon coast, her laughter ringing out as we ran along the beach, the waves crashing at our feet. She'd been radiant then, her joy a mirror to mine, and I'd believed it would last forever. But that was an illusion, a dream I'd clung to while she drifted away. Now, standing in the park, the wind tugging at my coat, I let that memory go. It didn't hurt anymore, not like it had. It was just a story, one I didn't need to tell myself anymore. I was done mourning what we'd been. I was ready to build something new, something mine. When I returned home, the sky had darkened, the threat of rain hanging heavy in the air. I went to the backyard, a small patch of grass bordered by trees, and built a fire in the pit we'd once used for summer nights. I carried the wedding photo out, the last tether to her, and held it over the flames. The glass reflected the firelight for a moment before I dropped it in, watching as the paper curled and blackened, the image of us consumed by the heat. The smoke rose into the sky, thick and acrid, and with it went the last of my illusions. She'd called me weak, but this wasn't weakness. This was power, the power to let go, to walk away, to choose myself. I stood there, the fire crackling, the heat warming my face, and felt a shift inside me. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it no longer defined me. I wasn't the man she'd accused me of being, passive, afraid, unworthy. I was something else, something stronger, forged in the crucible of her betrayal. She'd thought she could break me, that her words and actions would leave me shattered. But she'd miscalculated. By walking away, By letting her go, I was dismantling her narrative, exposing the truth she couldn't face. Her infidelity wasn't my failure, it was hers. The fire died down, leaving a pile of ash and embers, and I turned back to the house. The boxes were packed, the bourbon was gone, and the man I'd been was no more. I didn't know what came next, not fully, but I knew it would be on my terms. She'd started this game, but I was rewriting the rules. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. The rain returned that evening, a steady drumbeat against the windows, as if the sky itself was restless. I sat in the living room, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in an hour. The house was quieter now, stripped of her presence, the boxes in the garage a silent testament to my resolve. The fire from earlier had left a faint smell of smoke in the air, mingling with the dampness that seeped through the walls. I felt steady, grounded, a man no longer adrift in the chaos she'd left behind. But that steadiness was about to be tested. I'd gone to a coffee shop that afternoon, a small place downtown where the hum of conversation and the clink of cups offered a brief escape. I'd been reading, or trying to, when she appeared. She stood in the doorway, her coat dripping from the rain, her hair a tangled mess framing a face I barely recognized. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture hunched, a far cry from the confident woman who'd walked out 5 days ago. She spotted me and hesitated, then crossed the room with a determination that felt forced, her steps unsteady. I didn't move, didn't speak, just watched as she slid into the seat across from me, her hands trembling as she clasped them on the table. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, her gaze a mix of desperation and defiance. I remembered a time when those eyes had held me captive, when they'd sparkled with love and laughter. We'd spent a weekend in the mountains once, holed up in a cabin during a snowstorm, her eyes bright as she pressed herself against me, whispering promises of forever. I'd believed her then, believed in us, in the life we could build. But now, looking at her, I felt nothing, no longing, no pain, just a cold detachment that surprised me. She wasn't the woman I'd loved. She was a stranger, unraveling before my eyes. She started to speak, her voice low and strained, a plea wrapped in nostalgia. She talked about our past, about the good times, the moments I'd already burned away in the fire. She mentioned the cabin, the way we'd danced in the kitchen, the promises we'd made. It was a script, a calculated attempt to pull me back into her orbit, to make me feel the guilt she wanted me to carry. But I didn't respond. I sat there, silent, watching her words fall flat, watching her realize they had no power over me anymore. Her desperation grew, her voice rising slightly, a crack appearing in her facade. She reached for my hand, but I pulled it back, my movement deliberate, final. She left then, her face crumpling as she stood, her exit as abrupt as her arrival. I watched her go, the rain swallowing her silhouette, and felt a strange satisfaction. She'd come to me broken, seeking forgiveness or control. I wasn't sure which, but I'd given her neither. I'd let her see the man I'd become, the one who no longer bent to her will. I returned home, the encounter lingering in my mind, a confirmation of the shift inside me. She wasn't invincible. She was fragile, clinging to a narrative that was unraveling faster than she could hold it together. That evening, as the rain intensified, I heard a knock at the door. I knew it was her before I opened it. She stood on the porch, soaked and shivering, her eyes wild with a mix of anger and fear. She stepped forward, her voice rising as she begged to come back, to fix what she'd broken. She blamed Daniel, blamed herself, blamed me, her words a chaotic tangle of excuses and accusations. I remembered a night years ago when she'd mocked my vulnerability, laughing as I confessed my fears, her cruelty disguised as teasing. I'd let it slide then, convinced myself it was love, but now I saw it for what it was, her own insecurity, her need to feel superior, to keep me small. I didn't let her in. I stood in the doorway, the rain a curtain between us, and watched her unravel. She pounded on the frame, her pleas turning to shouts, but I felt no urge to comfort her, no need to fix this. I closed the door, locking it with a click that echoed in the silence, and listened as her voice faded into the storm. She'd called me weak, but here she was, desperate and powerless, while I stood firm. This wasn't about weakness anymore. It was about strength, mine, and her lack of it. I returned to the living room, the book still open, the rain a steady rhythm against the glass. The encounter had shaken me, but not in the way she'd hoped. It had solidified something, a certainty that I was no longer her pawn. She'd thought she could reclaim me, that her presence would pull me back into her game. But I was done playing. By walking away, by refusing her, I'd stripped her bare, exposed the insecurities she'd tried to bury beneath her betrayal. The storm raged outside, but inside, I was calm, a man reclaiming his life, one deliberate step at a time. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world outside slick and quiet, the streets reflecting a pale, watery sky. I stood at the kitchen window, a mug of coffee in my hand, the bitterness of it grounding me in the new day. The house felt lighter now, as if her absence had finally settled into something permanent, something I could build upon. The boxes in the garage were still there, untouched since I'd packed them, but they no longer loomed over me. They were just things, her things, and I was ready to let them go, along with the life they represented. A call came that afternoon, a mutual friend's voice hesitant on the other end. She'd seen my wife, ex-wife. I corrected myself, stumbling out of a bar downtown, her face flushed with alcohol, her words slurring as she ranted about me, about Daniel, about the mess she'd made. The friend didn't know the full story, didn't need to, but the details she shared painted a picture I could have predicted. Daniel had left her, tired of her chaos, her demands, and she was spiraling, drinking too much, showing up late to work, losing the job she'd once prized. I listened, my expression neutral, my heart unmoved. This wasn't my burden anymore. She'd built this prison for herself, and I wasn't the one holding the key. I remembered a night early in our marriage, sitting in a diner we loved, her hand in mine as she promised never to hurt me. The neon lights had buzzed overhead, casting a warm glow over her face, and I believed her, trusted her with a faith that felt unshakable. That memory used to sting, a reminder of what I'd lost, but now it was just noise, a faint echo from a past I'd outgrown. I drove past that diner later that day, its windows dark, the sign flickering faintly, and felt nothing, no nostalgia, no regret. It was just a place, like she was just a person, no longer the center of my world. I met with a divorce lawyer that week, a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp suit who laid out my options with a calm efficiency I appreciated. I'd gathered evidence, emails, the notebook, bank statements showing money she'd siphoned into a hidden account, and handed it over without hesitation. She nodded, her pen scratching notes as I spoke, and assured me the case was strong. Infidelity, financial deceit, abandonment, it was a clear path to a clean break, one I'd walk with my head high. I left her office feeling lighter, the weight of legal proceedings a small price to pay for the freedom I was claiming. I started rebuilding then, piece by piece, a life that was mine alone. I joined a gym, the ache of exertion a welcome distraction, my body growing stronger as my mind cleared. I reconnected with friends I'd let drift away, their laughter and stories filling the spaces she'd once occupied. I picked up hobbies she'd mocked, photography, hiking, finding solace in the click of the shutter, the crunch of leaves underfoot. The house began to reflect me, not us. New furniture, photos I'd taken, a space that felt like a fresh start. I didn't need her approval, her validation. I was enough, and that realization was a quiet triumph. Her downfall continued, a slow unraveling I watched from a distance. The friend called again, her voice softer this time, saying she'd moved into a cheap apartment, her belongings a scattered mess, her life a shadow of what it had been. I didn't gloat, didn't revel in her misery, but I felt a cold satisfaction. She'd called me weak, blamed me for her choices, but here I was, standing tall, while she crumbled under the weight of her own lies. This wasn't revenge, it was justice, a natural consequence of the game she'd played and lost. I drove to the lawyer's office one last time that week, signing papers that finalized the end of our marriage. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but my movements were steady, deliberate. I walked out into the fading daylight, the air crisp with the promise of autumn, and felt a sense of closure. She'd thought she could break me, that her betrayal would leave me shattered, but she'd been wrong. I'd walked away, not out of weakness, but out of strength, and in doing so, I'd exposed her for what she was, a woman undone by her own insecurities, her own failures. The house was quiet that night, but it was a peaceful silence, one I'd earned. I stood in the living room, looking out at the street, the world beyond the glass, a canvas of possibility. I wasn't the man she'd accused me of being, passive, afraid, unworthy. I was a man who'd survived, who'd rebuilt, who'd found power in letting go. She'd started this, but I'd finished it, and as the stars emerged in the darkening sky, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. The moving truck rumbled away down the street, its taillights fading into the early morning mist. I stood on the porch of my new apartment, a modest place on the outskirts of Portland, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The house in the suburbs was gone, sold to a young couple eager to build their own memories, its walls no longer mine to haunt. I'd packed my life into boxes, not hers, just mine, and brought them here, to a space that reflected the man I'd become. The furniture was simple, the walls adorned with photos I'd taken, the windows open to a view of trees stretching toward the horizon. This was my beginning, a slate wiped clean of her shadow. The divorce papers had arrived the day before, crisp and final, their ink a seal on the end of a chapter I'd once thought would define me. I'd signed them in the quiet of my new kitchen, the pen steady in my hand, my signature a declaration of freedom. The lawyer had called to confirm, her voice brisk but warm, congratulating me on a clean break. The settlement was fair, more than fair, given the evidence of her infidelity and deceit, but I didn't care about the money. What mattered was the closure, the knowledge that I'd walked away on my terms, leaving her to face the wreckage she'd created. I drove to a scenic overlook that afternoon, a spot high above the Willamette Valley where the world spread out in shades of green and gold. The sky was clear, the sun dipping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. I stood at the edge, the wind tugging at my jacket, and let the silence settle over me. This was a place we'd never been together, a view she'd never tainted, and it felt right to be here now, alone but whole. I thought about her, not with anger or pain, but with a detached curiosity. She'd faded from my life, a ghost of a woman who'd once held so much power over me, now reduced to a cautionary tale. I'd heard the updates through mutual friends, their voices tinged with pity or disbelief. She was still in that cheap apartment, her life a mess of unpaid bills and broken promises. Daniel was long gone, her job a distant memory, her pride shattered by the choices she couldn't escape. She tried to reach out once, a rambling voicemail I deleted without listening, her voice a faint echo I no longer needed to hear. She'd called me weak, blamed me for her straying, but the truth was laid bare in her downfall. It wasn't my weakness that had driven her away. It was her own insecurities, her fear of being ordinary, her need to control a narrative she couldn't sustain. I remembered a moment from our early days, a night when she'd laughed at my dreams, her voice sharp as she mocked my ambition to take up photography. "You'll never be good enough," she'd said, her words a dagger disguised as a joke. I'd let it slide then, convinced myself it was her way of pushing me to be better, but now I saw it for what it was, her own doubt, projected onto me to keep me small. That memory had once hurt, a wound I'd carried in silence, but standing here, with the wind in my hair and the sun on my face, I smiled. I'd proven her wrong. The photos on my walls, the hikes I'd taken, the life I'd built, they were mine, earned through a strength she couldn't comprehend. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't the man she'd accused me of being, passive, afraid, unworthy. I was a man who'd survived her betrayal, who'd walked away not out of weakness, but out of power. By letting her go, by refusing to play her game, I'd stripped her bare, revealed the insecurities she'd hidden beneath her lies. She'd thought she could break me, that her words would leave me shattered, but she'd misjudged me. I'd emerged stronger, not because of her, but in spite of her. I turned from the overlook, the valley stretching out below, and walked back to my car. The drive home was quiet, the radio off, my thoughts my only company. I didn't need noise to fill the silence. I was enough, and that was a victory she could never take from me. When I stepped into my apartment, the space welcomed me, a sanctuary built from the ashes of what we'd been. I stood at the window, watching the last light fade from the sky, and knew I'd won. Not by fighting her, not by proving her wrong, but by walking away, by choosing myself. She'd claimed my weakness had forced her to stray, but in the end, it was my strength that revealed her true insecurities. And as the stars emerged, one by one, in the darkening sky, I closed the blinds and turned away, ready to live a life that was wholly, unapologetically mine.